Good morning. I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Welcome to the latest in conversation, sponsored by Metrojet of Hong Kong. We are once again speaking with Subhas Menon. He's the Director General of the Association of Asia-Pacific Airlines. Subhas, welcome back. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me again.
We spoke, I think it was August when I looked at the spreadsheet, and things were kind of looking up at the time. Vaccinations were rolling out, things like that. Governments were opening up a little bit. Asia Pacific was looking up in some places. You had Cambodia was easing the quarantines, Thailand. Singapore was talking about vaccinated travel lanes. Unfortunately, Hong Kong and China are still maintaining a zero COVID policy, which is impossible to maintain. What's the overall picture from your viewpoint?
Yeah, I mean, when Omicron hit, I think, governments immediately reimpose restrictions. So we thought that, this is going to be short-lived because it's a new virus or a new variant. And even the WHO said that this is very serious, so governments were probably being cautious and decided to take a safe approach. And we expected that soon after that, once they realized that Omicron is not as bad, and in fact it is spread to almost the rest of the world, they will also start looking at putting back their reopening plans on track. So we are seeing that happening in most places. But as you mentioned, China and Hong Kong, they are still sticking to their guns in terms of their zero COVID strategy. I think basically governments wanted to assess whether hospitalization and ICU presentation, were going to be manageable, whether their resources can cope with all these things. And I think that's the same with China and Hong Kong as well, So most of the countries, I mean, we've seen Australia was always very risk averse, but even Australia has announced reopening their borders from the 21st of February. We see that happening in Thailand and Philippines. Of course, Singapore has always been ahead of the curve. Malaysia has announced that they're going to reopen their borders from March. Very important is when governments do this, it must be quarantine-free for fully vaccinated travelers. And secondly, we also hope that testing requirements will be eased. I mean, if you really think about it, if COVID is everywhere and it is being driven by community infection, what is the difference between going to a shopping center and jumping on a plane to go on international travel for fully vaccinated people? You don't need to be tested if you're going into a shopping center, So you shouldn't have that for international travel as well. Initially, yes, but hopefully governments will agree to use ART testing or rapid antigen testing rather than PCR testing, because we don't want any of these things to be impediment for potential travelers. And quarantine is definitely an impediment, and so is testing.
Well, that brings up a good point because Singapore Air Show starts tomorrow. We're recording this on Valentine's Day. Hope you sent your other half some roses or something. But the Singapore Air Show is starting, and overseas travelers have to have a supervised test every single day. I have to, even though I live in Singapore, I still have to test, but it's a self-test, so I don't have to go to a supervised place or anything. And talking about testing as well, IATA said the other day that pre-departure testing for destinations like the U.S. was unnecessary. For fully vaccinated travelers, let's make sure we add that caveat in there. And I'm curious because the Singapore Air Show, we had the Dubai Air Show back in November, and they had something like 104,000 people there. There were no testing requirements. There was some social distancing. People wore masks. And it was a great show. They did really well. Singapore, obviously, a lot smaller show this year than 2020 even, obviously because of the pandemic. But is all this testing really necessary if you're fully vaccinated and you get an on-arrival PCR test? Why the testing every single day? That's got to hurt not just aviation, but air shows like the Singapore Air Show.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, there's a difference between the Dubai Air Show and the Singapore Air Show, because the Dubai Air Show was before Omicron, became so widespread, and the number of cases has really shot up across the world, because of Omicron. Secondly, here the Singapore government has actually set a standard, in managing events, during COVID, living with COVID but managing events. So I think they are taking a stab in the dark on how to organize an air show while COVID cases are surging, and they are trying to make sure that the event is conducted safely, and it's not going to be a super spreader event. So I think it's early days. So I think they might do it. I mean, if you look at what the Singapore government is doing for air travel, they have already said that those who have recovered from COVID don't need to undergo any PCR tests if they're coming into Singapore. So that is a good indication of how the government is very progressive in making different regulations. They organized the Bloomberg forum recently. It was a great success, and I think they just want to make sure that the air show is also a success. So overcautious, you might say, but I suppose it is as a way of trying to live with the virus and learn how to manage the risks as they go about it.
I know, and it's still kind of on testing and quarantines and things like that. And I know IATA and organizations like AAPA, you don't really like to get involved in politics and things like that. But in China and Hong Kong, can the aviation industry and I guess the whole travel ecosystem in a way, with hotels, rental cars, restaurants, food and beverage, things like that, but can aviation really survive when you have these zero COVID policies in place? And I mean, Hong Kong, I think, has loosened the quarantine a little bit. I think they went from 21 days to 14 days, if I'm not mistaken, which is something. But still, expat bankers in Hong Kong, they're voting with their feet and they're moving to other places right now. I mean, how is the aviation industry going to survive if they keep that in place in China and Hong Kong?
Well, I mean, as we have seen, a zero COVID strategy isn't going to work. We have seen, many places where they have moved from zero COVID. I mean, Australia, New Zealand are the most glaring examples because it doesn't work. With Omicron especially, just with a few cases, and before you know it, you reach up to 40, 50,000 cases a day. So I personally don't think it is a realistic strategy to adopt. But at the same time, I think where governments are reluctant to open the floodgates is because of concerns about their hospital resources and ability to cope with it. And I think China is looking at the example of India last year, and India really struggled, with the huge number of cases, so we can sort of understand. I mean, China might be able to survive for a longer period. Their aviation industry may be able to survive for a longer period because they have a huge domestic market. But when it comes to Hong Kong, it's not the same. Hong Kong is a hub. It's an interconnection point. And for Hong Kong to adopt the same strategies, it's a bit surprising. I would say. And I think generally governments, will look for evidence elsewhere, and they will learn from the evidence. And I think, I remain optimistic that, the Hong Kong government will also realize that, other connecting hubs like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, they're all getting on with the act of reopening their borders without quarantine and even limited testing, to boost the tourism sector, because Asia Pacific, tourism accounts for 12% of the GDP, as well as cargo. Cargo is also being, the demand for cargo is huge, but the supply is not there to meet the demand, So the whole economy is actually affected, by this prolonged restrictions on international travel, So I think even Hong Kong will soon realize that you really have to learn to live with it, because it's gone on for too long.
Let's talk about digitization. I think digital health passports, like
Yes.
IATA's Travel Pass, things like that, they're going to be with us for a while. until things settle down, until the pandemic goes away, whenever that's going to be. I want to combine a couple of questions here. I've been talking about this for a long time, standards, getting the governments to agree on standards for these kinds of things, because there's all kinds of digital passports or health tracking devices, whatever you want to call it. There's dozens out there in the market. When are we going to see governments agree on standards so that you can have one application? Again, I go back to the yellow card that I started traveling with a long time ago. It was one card. Everybody recognized it. Obviously, it was on paper, but it was recognized around the world for your yellow fever vaccination, whatever. When are we going to get some standards? And secondly, when places have opened up, we've seen huge pin-up demand. I mean, it's absolutely boomed. People flood the airports. They're ready to travel. So the demand is there, but the airports are going to be swamped trying to process, all these paper documents and everything. Talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Matt. I think the pent-up demand is really huge, and as soon as borders are opened and flights are put in place, the take-up rate is fantastic, as we've seen with the vaccinated travel lanes started by Singapore Airlines. Huge take-up in all those flights. So I think this is something which is very encouraging for the industry. As far as the standards are concerned, actually the standards have already been provided. WHO has come up with the standards as far as the certificates are concerned, and ICAO has come up with what is known as the visible digital seal, which is basically a QR code or a barcode, 2D barcode, which can be produced in paper or digital format, for governments to adopt. And for digital identification, it makes use of the e-passport technology, so it's all there. What we need is for governments, to adopt these things and sanction airlines to make use of these things. Airlines, many airlines have already signed up for the travel passes, whether you're talking about IATA, mostly IATA travel passes. But the travel passes are basically, a tool. We need governments to agree on these standard certificates, standard formats, so that when you populate these travel passes, that they work. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult. And IATA is doing whatever it can, to help airlines to coordinate with their governments, to populate these travel passes with the forms. I know Australia has already adopted the visible digital seal, and if you are an Australian citizen, if you're traveling out of Australia, you can adopt this and you can use the IATA travel pass to have this 2D barcode on your mobile device. So I think the onus is on governments, firstly, to adopt these things. Airlines are talking to their governments. The other thing is the measures themselves. I mean, we've been talking about harmonizing all these measures, and nothing has happened on that front. So what we hope for, I think it is a pipe dream to get governments to agree on a common set of measures. But at least if there is some coordination, it's streamlining of these measures, bilaterally or multilaterally, based on risk assessment, not to just every government just doing their own thing, right? So if they can coordinate some of these things, I think the travel passes are there, are ready to go. We just need the governments to make sure that they sanction it with the proper authentication.
Yeah, it'd be nice if that happened sooner rather than later. So
Yes.
I'm ready to get on a plane again. Subhas, we need to take a quick break here to hear from our sponsor, Metrojet of Hong Kong. We'll be right back after this.
Thank you.
We're going to have the crown jewels of Asia, and I promise you we're going to have the nicest and busiest business aviation hangar in the region.
And we're back. We're speaking with Subhas Menon, the Director General of the Association of Asia-Pacific Airlines. Subhas, in Asia, passenger traffic last 2 years, decimated is the only word you can really use. And you talked about this just before the break with cargo. It's been going gangbusters. Capacity's not quite there to meet the demand. We've seen a lot of moves, freighter conversions, and also so-called freighters, where the passenger deck on a plane is reconfigured for not a regular cargo container, but sort of lighter cargo. Tell us a little bit more about the cargo.
Yeah, I think cargo has really been the silver lining in the cloud for the airlines. You talked about decimation of travel. Just to emphasize the point, 2020 was bad. But in 2021, international air traffic was just over 20% of what it was in 2020. So can you imagine? It's 2020 was already bad, and 2021 was even worse than 2020. So this also affects cargo capacity, because demand has really shot through the roof. Yields are also very strong, but capacity is not there, because belly hold capacity is also affected by flights being cut. So in spite of all that, cargo revenue, which used to be say 10% of the total revenue, is now a third of total revenue. So cargo is making a bigger impact for airlines. It's of course helping to mitigate the losses, but it will never be enough for airlines to overcome their losses. So when you see freighters or P-freighters or whatever you were saying just now, I think it just shows the resilience of the industry and the ability for the airlines to be creative, find creative solutions to cope with the situation. There is whether cargo is going to be the mainstay and even be more important than passenger revenue. I don't think so. I think after a few years, I think, as we talked about earlier, I think the international air travel market in the Asia-Pacific region will definitely pick up. And it's expected to be, 3 times what it was in 2019. So I think it will happen again. And but cargo will continue to play an important part. I think there has been a shift to some extent from sea freight to air freight. Apart from COVID, which has affected staff resources and also other resources in the shipping industry. There has also been port closures, which has seen a big shift to air freight. Also the type of goods, during this process, we have seen, the demand for medical equipment, demand for IT goods and all that going up significantly. I think those things will still stay. So I think air cargo will grow, will be more important than what it was before, but not at the expense of international air traffic and air traffic revenue.
So we're going to move on to another topic, sustainability. That seems to be the word of the day for the Singapore Air Show and the industry itself. PR companies are going crazy, sending out press releases, talking about green credentials, talking about hydrogen to a certain extent, sustainable aviation fuel or SAF. What are your member airlines talking about when it comes to sustainability, and how serious are they?
Well, as we talked about it before, Matt, hydrogen electric aircraft, it's still a long way down the road, and in any case, it's for, more suitable for short haul operations, Whereas for Asia-Pacific Airlines, 80%, of our RPKs is in long-haul international travel, So from that perspective, sustainable aviation fuel is probably the most important aspect for us to achieve our sustainability goals. But even sustainable aviation fuels, it'll take quite a while, before we have adequate and cost-effective supply of sustainable aviation fuels. We are looking at maybe 2035, when we really, have realistic ability to make use of sustainable aviation fuels. Meanwhile, we have to rely on our operational efficiencies, fuel efficiency of the aircraft, which has been improving along the way. and also CORSIA. CORSIA is an important measure, for international aviation. It is a readily available tool because it was multilaterally agreed in 2016. Is already in place for international long-haul operation. That is the mainstay. I would say CORSIA and sustainable aviation fuels are more or less, two sides of the same coin. Until we reach adequate quantities of sustainable aviation fuels, you still have to rely on offsets, to take out, whatever emissions that you are already introducing, even with fuel-efficient aircraft. So these are the areas which our membership is focusing on. We don't want to sit on our hands, waiting for sustainable aviation fuels to be ready. I mean, at the end of the day, we are still users. We need the help of governments. We need the help of fuel suppliers. To be able to get enough SAF, to find enough feedstock and to establish enough plants and to supply sustainable aviation fuels in a cost-effective way. So until then, I think we are also not going to lose momentum. We're going to also focus on CORSIA, ICAO CORSIA, so that by the time sustainable aviation fuels are readily available, we have not done too much damage to the environment.
We talked about, and this really quickly, I mean, you talked about fuel-efficient planes, better engines, things like that. Are you seeing your members, are they stepping up and refleeting with the newer planes, or are they still using the planes that they've had in storage for the past year?
Yeah, well, they are using the planes in their storage, but the planes that they're using are the more fuel-efficient ones, smaller and leaner and more efficient aircraft. So, of course, this could be for economic reasons, but also it is beneficial in terms of their sustainability agenda. There are some airlines already looking beyond the immediate horizon to look at what aircraft they need. I think today's Straits Times talk about Singapore Airlines and their new 777-9. So I think it's happening. Of course, there's some immediate concerns, cash flow and other concerns immediately. But I think it is an all-industry effort. The manufacturers are also working with the airlines to see how they can meet their requirements, fuel-efficient aircraft as well as sustainable aviation fuel-ready aircraft within the next, I would say, 30-year time frame. So that is also taking place on the cargo front as well. I think we are also seeing 777 freighters being rolled out. So there too, I think there is some focus on fuel efficiency and more sustainable aircraft into the future.
So it's time to get the old crystal ball out, or the jaw sticks, or tarot cards, or whatever you use to predict the future. AAPA, IATA, lots of other associations say international traffic is not going to get back to normal until 2024. In Asia, it's a little bit all over the place. I would have thought Japan would be okay, but I understand the traffic there is not very good. China, domestic traffic okay. Vietnam, domestic traffic okay. Still hard to get around Asia a little bit. Depends on the country you're going to. What's the situation going to look like 6 months from now, and then sort of a year from now, barring any new variant of the coronavirus coming into play?
Well, I think domestic traffic, is going to get back to 2019 levels probably by the end of this year. So domestic travel, I think, with traffic, I mean, not only in China, but I think across the Asia-Pacific region, it's going to get back there. International travel, I would think that it's going to be a slow, hard climb. It's not going to be immediate, as we have seen. Slowly governments are introducing more travel-friendly regulations. It is very important for Asia Pacific that China and India open up, because these are the mammoths of the industry in the Asia Pacific region. China especially. I mean, India, I think it's a matter of time before they open their borders for international travel. But China particularly, China produces a lot of tourists and China receives a lot of tourists. So we need China to open up, So, and China has said that they don't see opening up their borders until 2023, So I think IATA's prediction is pretty much on the money, 2024 until we get back to 2019 levels. But I think if governments introduce these relaxing regulations and they don't revert to form, by stopping and starting again, then I think we should see at least maybe 50% of what it was in 2019 by the end of this year, and then after that towards 2024 we will see 2019 levels again.
Last question. I always try to end these shows on a bright spot. What are you looking forward to at AAPA?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that we can be thankful for. One, of course, is the scientific fraternity. I think they've been amazing. I mean, with these vaccines, and every day they are coming up with therapeutic solutions for COVID-19. So they are absolutely important. In a way, you could say that Omicron is a blessing in disguise because it is not a severe form of COVID. After countries see a peak being reached, you find hospitalization and ICU rates falling significantly. So now we have a situation where almost all countries are potential exporters of COVID rather than importers. So that must augur well for international travel. You don't have to worry about importation because it is basically being driven by community infection. And last but not least, and I think this is very important, how the industry has come together. I mean, the financial situation with the airlines, notwithstanding, the airlines are still around. They're still doing a service in terms of repatriation of people as well as supplies. So they're playing an important part, and this is because the whole industry has come together. The creditors, the lessors, they have been playing their part as well to help airlines to go through this. Airports, governments, they all, I think, working quite hard. ICAO is also playing a leader's role in this whole thing, IATA and other industry organizations as well. So the industry has come together like never before, So I think that augurs well, and I think if we stay together and we remain resilient, I think, the future is going to be bright again.
Subhas Menon, Director General of the Association of Asia-Pacific Airlines, thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thank you, Matt, and all the best to you.